So the ideas I'll be presenting here today were very much a collaborative effort with my co-author, Vanessa Azenwa from UGA. So the interaction between host behavior and parasitism is particularly fascinating because the links readily go in both directions. Numerous host behaviors like foraging and grooming affect the likelihood that a host will become parasitized, as well as the likelihood that they will transmit. And in turn, parasites can have far-reaching effects on host behavior, whether by altering host-mediated changes in behavior or due to parasite manipulation of host behavior. But to what extent do these distinct links self-reinforce each other, emerging as feedbacks? I want to start by defining what we mean by a behavior-parasite feedback. And I want to do that using an example that's been nicely shown by Marlene Zook, Robin Tingatella, and others. And that is the calling behavior of male Hawaiian field crickets. Their calls are essentially eavesdropped upon by these parasitoid flies that use the calls to detect their hosts, and thus this behavior increases parasitic fly populations and feeds back to lead to strong selection on the behavior of the male crickets, and has caused evolutionary changes in their calling that allow them to better evade these parasitoid flies. Another quick example comes from foraging of ground-feeding herbivores. So this foraging behavior often results in accidental gastrointestinal parasite ingestion. And as the adult worms develop, they can cause several types of changes in the foraging behavior of these hosts, including reductions in foraging, termed anorexia, or changes in the type of diet they eat, potentially as a form of self-medication. In both of these cases, host behavior altered parasites in a way that fed back directly on the same host behavior that led to parasitism in the first place. I hope these examples help to illustrate the kind of key elements of these behavior parasite feedbacks. First, host behaviors have to create variation in parasitism. And this can come from a variety of different host behaviors, and probably this assumption occurs across all animal parasite systems. Second, parasites have to create variation in host behavior. We may think of that happening most often post-infection, but parasites in the environment can also create variation in host behavior before they even infect a host, if a host is altering their habitat use or interactions with conspecifics in order to minimize parasite risk. Now, when both of these steps co-occur and self-reinforce each other, feedbacks will result. Importantly, these feedbacks can operate both within a generation, like the sheep example, or between generation, like the cricket example, which would be an evolutionary feedback. Now, I've shown these kind of key assumptions in stepwise fashion here, starting with host behavior. But in addition to these behavior-initiated feedbacks, you can also have what we're terming parasite-initiated feedbacks. Same idea, but we've simply switched the order of parasites and behavior here. As an example, some of the parasite manipulation systems are classic kind of parasite-initiated feedbacks. So the Gordian worms that parasitize terrestrial arthropods cause these dramatic changes in their host behavior, whereby they are attracted to water, jump into a water body, essentially committing suicide, and allowing that adult worm to emerge, thus feeding back to increase the population size of the parasite. So for these parasite-initiated feedbacks, parasites are altering host behavior in ways that feed back directly on parasites. This need not only be in manipulation systems. For example, sickness behaviors are behavioral changes initiated by parasites onto host behavior that then feed back to likely affect parasite transmission. So even though the distinction between behavior-initiated and parasite-initiated is likely quite blurred in natural systems, we felt that this distinction was useful because there are likely to be some biological differences between these two types of feedbacks. In particular, because parasites have such a rapid generation time, we expect that feedbacks from behavior back to parasites down here may often occur both as ecological and evolutionary feedbacks, somewhat on similar timescales. So you may have host behavior altering both parasite population sizes as well as genotype frequencies at the same time. So now that we've defined feedbacks, what can we predict in terms of their outcomes? So we look to the cell signaling literature, where there's been a lot of work on what the system level outcomes of some of the negative versus positive feedbacks might be. So to start with the negative feedbacks, one sort of interesting phenomenon is that negative feedbacks in cell signaling can result in either a sort of stabilizing outcome or an adaptive change outcome. And we wondered whether similar things might apply for behavior parasite feedbacks. When we think about the general homeostasis process, where you start with some kind of physiological imbalance, illustrated on the bottom here, that produces a stimulus, effector mechanisms respond to restore homeostasis, we can imagine that behavior parasite feedbacks can act kind of similarly. So in particular, we go back to that sheep example, the host physiological changes with parasitism may lead to a behavioral effector mechanism like anorexia or adjusting foraging rate downward that then helps to restore homeostasis. What's also interesting is that the pathway to homeostasis can also involve adaptive change, just like is seen in these cell signaling systems. So in the same sort of host parasite system, the host may respond not only by exhibiting anorexia, but instead by potentially switching to feed on another food item as a form of self-medication that also helps to ultimately restore homeostasis. So we were very intrigued by the possibility that these behavior parasite feedbacks that likely commonly occur in natural systems may be broadly important sources of both stability and change. Stability in the sense that parasites are one of the most common perturbations in natural systems, and these behavior feedbacks may be one way of maintaining homeostasis, and change in the sense that some of the behavioral novelties that we see, like self-medication, may sort of be derived from these responses to parasite feedbacks. What also intrigued us is that feedbacks like homeostasis operate really across scales of organization. So the sheep example was a classic example of a within individual homeostasis, where a host may adjust their food intake within some boundaries over time to maintain health. But you can similarly imagine that homeostasis can also act within a group or within a colony. For example, some ant colonies can respond very rapidly behaviorally when a parasite is introduced to basically put a rapid end to the epidemic. This is, in a sense, using behavior to restore within group or colony level homeostasis by eliminating the pathogen. And finally, we might even argue that antagonistic coevolution between parasite traits like virulence, shown here in red, and host behavioral traits like mate choosiness, shown here in black, might be a form of within population homeostasis. So keeping both sets of traits within some boundary via antagonistic selection from the other. So what about positive feedbacks? In the interest of time, I'm just going to show you two examples of positive feedbacks that come from cell signaling systems that are likely to apply to host behavior systems as well. So the first is amplification, where you get exaggeration of a behavior or parasite trait. And this likely happens quite often, particularly in sort of sexual signaling, parasite-mediated sexual selection in host behavior systems. You might also get the outcome of bistability, and this is probably more rare, but you could imagine a situation where you get the maintenance of, say, an avoider and a non-avoider genotype or phenotype in a given host population. One kind of interesting potential example of a positive behavior parasite feedback that would fall under amplification is one derived from group living. So there's a lot of evidence that sociality increases parasite risk for many hosts, and there's growing evidence that parasites can often favor higher host sociality as a way of better surviving infection, as occurs in Yellowstone wolves, for example. So there's not any current empirical evidence for this full feedback loop, but we thought this was an intriguing possibility that parasite behavior feedbacks might sort of together favor host sociality. So overall, we think these feedbacks are likely quite important and universal across many natural systems, but they're very challenging to study. So right now, we probably have more questions than answers. I already alluded to this first question. Does the feedback process help to generate novelty in either behavior or even in parasite traits? How does the environmental context influence these feedbacks? Are they most common during the mating season or at certain times of the year? Are some host behaviors more likely than others to be involved in feedbacks, particularly evolutionary ones? And can feedbacks even operate across species, potentially influencing co-infection outcomes between parasites? Hopefully we'll have time to discuss some of these interesting questions during the Q&A session. Thanks very much.